Today I'm speaking with Clay Arnall. Clay, thank you so much for joining me today.
No problem. Thanks for having me on here.
Yeah, I'm so glad we get a chance to connect. Clay, by the way, is a YouTuber. We're going to talk about that soon, but I've kind of watched some of your videos from a distance. I actually came across your channel a while ago, so I've kind of known about you a little bit, but I'm so glad to finally get to know more of your story here today. But just to give a quick bio, Clay lives in British Columbia up in Canada, and he's also, again, a fellow YouTuber. I'll have the link for his YouTube channel beneath our video. Please go like and subscribe and check out his work. And we're going to talk about a specific video in this interview. I'll have a link for that as well. Please go check it out here. And if you like what he's saying too much, you can just pause my interview and go to his channel, watch that video, and come back to this one. But going back to the bio, Clay has a degree in computer science, and he's also worked in the field of computer games. And right now he's focused on an e-commerce business that he runs, but he's also a musician and he likes to do mountain sports. So if you could, with that short bio in mind, could you tell us first a little bit about life up in British Columbia and more about your YouTube channel, and then anything else about you that you could we could know about you?
Sure. Yeah. So I live in this little town. Well, it's a small city, I guess, called Kelowna, BC, and it's around 3 or 4 hours east of Vancouver on the west coast. And it's kind of this little place in a valley, and it's in the mountains. There's a lot of ski hills, and so we do a lot of skiing and snowboarding in the winter. There's a bunch of lakes, so in the summer we do that. I really like to kite surf, actually. It's one of
Nice.
my favorite things to do. So we can do that on the lakes here or over on the coast. But yeah, it's I think when most people from big cities come here, it seems like a small place, but it's growing a lot. So
Hmm,
that's where I'm from.
that's awesome. And what's your YouTube channel all about?
Well, it started off talking, one of the first videos I did was about personality. And there's the 16 personalities. So I had discovered that I was this INFJ personality. And I remember at the time it was such a epiphany for me because it kind of explained some of my mannerisms and maybe why I felt so, I don't know, a little bit like an alien now and then. So I made this video. I threw it out there and it ended up getting just tons of views. So I was like, oh, maybe I should make some more. So I've made more videos about that. I talk a lot about psychology. I really enjoy psychology, I've realized. So I love researching things like personality disorders, like what's borderline personality disorder. I realize it's a bit of a strange thing for people, or narcissism or sociopaths, things like that. I just really love trying to figure out people, is what I've realized. I also am quite a philosophical person at times, but I'm sort of like a rational philosophical person. So I really enjoy sort of learning what all the great philosophers have said, especially ever since leaving Christianity. I feel like I missed a part of that in my life growing up, what all these other people have to say about stuff.
Yeah.
So I'll talk about philosophy. Yeah, and then I've talked a little bit about religion. I did this video called Why I Left Christianity, and that kind of got quite popular. I've also done a couple other videos where I touch on religion a little bit. Like there's this one I did on, 14 logical fallacies in 14 minutes. I think that's what the video is called, because I really enjoyed logic. That's what I've realized too. And I use an example for every logical fallacy in that video. And I just couldn't help but throw in some religious examples. I tried to kind of pepper it around a bunch of different topics, but yeah, it's funny just the reactions people have. A
Hmm.
lot of very angry people because I used, for the circular reasoning example. There's this perfect example of this guy, explaining why is the Bible true? Well, because God says it's true. And why is God true? It's because the Bible says it's true. It's like this perfect circular argument. Things like that, I just can't help but throw it in now and then. And so, yeah, I'm kind of at this point now with that YouTube channel. I'm like, I've been trying to figure out what am I doing with this? Yeah, on Instagram and stuff like that, I can't help but talk about Christianity more. I just have a lot of thoughts and a lot of things I could say, and it's almost just, it's like sticking out to me lately. All the nonsense and all the irrationality. I actually don't really know what to do about it.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of just existing right now, making my way through it all.
Yeah. Well, we really appreciate your voice and all that. And I do hope people will go when we're done here and check out your great work there. But at this point, we love to just kind of give people the chance to tell their story. I wanted to encourage you, if you could, to just take us back to the earliest days. What shaped your worldview? What were you taught? And what was it like growing up as a Christian?
Yeah, okay. So my parents became Christians, I think when I was around maybe 2 years old. So as far as I'm concerned, I was kind of just born into it as long as I can remember. Um, I think also my mom was just or still is, she's a very spiritual person, kind of looking for those spiritual connections everywhere. So she became a Christian, and she became quite intense of a Christian, I guess. So yeah, we went to church. She's also a musician, and so she was very involved with the music in the church. Um, my mom's also a bit of like, she's a strong woman, I guess I should say. So she's always trying to push the boundaries a little bit with the music. I remember back then it was funny because in our church, it was an Alliance church that I kind of grew up in. Even having a guitar on the stage, I remember back then was a bit of it was like, oh, that's kind of like, some people thought it was the devil's instrument, right? Like, the rock and roll and things like that. So I remember, was one of the first people to bring a guitar up on stage to play worship music. And I remember people were upset about that. But she also directed the choir and wrote cantatas for the choir. She played piano, sang a lot. So I kind of grew up in that context. And from a young age, I did a lot of music as well, because there's all these instruments around the house. So I learned how to play guitar, and I did play piano a little bit until I just really enjoyed guitar. So I played a lot more guitar. And then eventually my sister was playing drums, and I kind of just took over her drum set, and I just really loved the drums. So drums became my main instrument. And I played drums in church, like pretty much, oh, and guitar. So I pretty much, from the time I was young, I started playing on the worship teams all the way until in my 20s, I guess, mid 20s.
Hmm.
I did a lot of music. I played on a lot of different worship teams, lots of different bands. So that was kind of my focus when it came to church. But
What age would you say you officially became a Christian? Was there a time where the pastor had a sermon or a preacher or some kind really encouraged you to figure out if you're really right with God, and where it got kind of serious?
yeah, I remember, I think I became a Christian numerous times. I think I was a bit of an anxious child, and the thought of hell, I remember, was quite overwhelming. So I became a Christian many times, but I do remember maybe one of the first times was with my mom in bed, like before bed. She basically like led me through it. All I have to do is this, then I'm good, right? I'm saved. I'm not going to go to hell. So, and then all the various church interactions, I would do it again and again, and then youth groups, and I went to Christian school. Well, elementary, I didn't go to a Christian school, but in high school, I went to a Christian school. I was really involved in the worship team at school even. And I was playing in the youth bands, and I was playing at church on Sunday mornings.
Hmm.
Um,
Can I ask, were those extra times where you said you made another profession of faith, that were those times because you were just fearful that the first times weren't legitimate, like you maybe said the words but didn't really mean it in your heart of hearts? Or was there something else going on?
I don't know. I guess I just wanted to make sure. It's sort of like, I think one thing I've noticed about myself is that I don't hold a firm conclusion well. And it's one thing I've noticed compared to other Christians, is that they're so sure about stuff, always so sure. I don't know if I've ever felt like, I'm always just a little worried. I'm like, have I done this right? Am I on the right track? I hope I'm doing it, basically. So I think that's probably why I was just, always doing this almost more out of an anxiety or a fear. I wanted to make sure God wasn't mad at me. I wanted to make sure I was good with God, right? I prayed a lot. So my mom taught me to pray constantly, basically, that I needed to pray throughout the day, and I needed to be having this conversation and talking about my problems and my issues and what I needed, what I wanted, what I was trying to accomplish.
Was there ever kind of a finality to any of those professions where you just kind of sense like, all right, yeah, I'm definitely secure. I understand enough. I know the gospel. I know I'm a sinner and he's the savior. I know he died and rose again, and it was, to cover my sins. I definitely believe it. I definitely believe I'm a sinner, and I definitely believe he's my substitute. That's it. Like, this is, nailed shut. I am definitely at peace with God. Was there a point at which that kind of smoothed out like that?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is I always just accepted it as true. I just took it as the common sense that this was the system. Jesus came, died for our sins. I just need to tap into that in order to save myself, basically, or he'll allow him to save me. I took the system as 100% true. I think I just wanted, my anxiety surrounded, am I doing it right? But I got baptized when I was probably, I was about 14. And I remember that was kind of it was a comforting moment for me, because I'm like, this is it was like a proclamation to the whole church. I gave a little speech. I was kind of taught that being baptized is important, and as long as it's under your own free will, I guess, and you're not being coerced into being baptized, which I wasn't. And so I did actually, that gave me an element of comfort that I was sort of on the right path at the time, I remember.
Like, you're definitely needing to make sure it was clear you were serious about the Lord by that point.
Yeah, it was more of a public declaration.
Hmm.
I think also I was like a fairly shy person as a kid too. So I remember being quite anxious and a little stressed out about trying to talk to people about Jesus, like people that aren't Christians. But the reality is I just didn't. Everybody in my life was kind of a Christian. So I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things about most of these religions, is it's sort of these communities are so small and tight. You're not really given an opportunity to think differently, to learn, anything else.
It's true.
I think also it's funny, in these communities, people just assume that everybody thinks like them, so they don't even really bother challenging each other or really finding out what each other believe. It's just assumed we all believe this thing. That's what I find. And then, a lot of it is just about, feeling good, essentially, is what it seems like. But I feel like for me, it was the worship and the music that made me feel connected and closer to God. Yeah.
So you didn't share the gospel too much with people then, you're saying, that at least at that stage in life?
No, at that stage, I was pretty shy.
Yeah.
So I didn't, but I also didn't need to, just because, I think just most of the people that I hung out with were Christians, is the reality. So I didn't really need to do that.
What was your impressions like in church, besides just the worship part of it, in terms of, again, not your participation in it as a worship leader or player, but just when you were completely a participant and you're just worshiping, as someone that's receiving the music, not playing it, and in terms of, hearing the sermons and taking part in the Lord's table and the bread and the wine. What was it like just being a worshiper in your church, and like in your heart? Did you feel like you were truly sensing the Lord in your life and in your heart?
Yes. Yes, especially when I got a little bit older and maybe I was like in youth group and stuff. And, I went to Christian camps and stuff too. It was I think it's funny, right? Because I've actually thought a lot about this. It's like, why did I think I felt it? Um, and it's sort of like those tingles, right? It's that sort of slight bit of euphoria, that tingly feeling. I always took that as God's presence. I feel like now I can explain that easily in other ways, just a little bit of a dopamine rise, and you can feel that way. Um, and you go to a regular concert and feel that. But I think at the time, I'd almost try to like induce that state, I think. And I felt like that's, in those moments is where I felt close to God. We were connected, and then you go to like summer camps and things like that. And it's almost like that experience is exemplified or amplified. And then, you leave summer camp and it's almost like that feeling goes away a little bit, and so I remember that would stress me out a little bit. I'm like, oh, am I losing touch with that feeling? Like, um,
I definitely can relate to what you're saying, especially about the music. And one thing I was going to ask, did you ever go to like a Christian concert where they intentionally play it super, super loud? Like, for example, I went to a concert when I was a teenager for a group called Newsboys. Ever heard of
oh
them?
yeah, I listen to
And
Newsboys.
yeah, they were just, and they're already really kind of cool to listen to as a Christian. But like, if you're actually like in a huge stadium with those monster speakers, and they can literally shake the floor with their music because of what they're doing. You literally at a certain point get this feeling that just like tingles down your whole body, and you're like, is that the spirit? Like I literally feel physically something like going from the top of my neck right down my body. Did you ever feel that and wonder, is that the spirit?
I think there's something really important going on with the music. And it's actually one of the points I made in my video, which is what is a Christian, right? In the beginning, because I think that, I could go into more in this a little bit, but in the beginning, it was a Christ follower. And it's like a little Christ. That's what a Christian means, a little Christ. And it was almost a term given to the Christians, from what I understand, from what I've been told. It's kind of hard to know these things for sure with the way history is written, I guess. But the word Christian, little Christ, or follower of Christ, but is my thought that Christianity has been redefined into Christ worshiper. And this made so much sense to me because when I was near the end, I was really struggling with that Christ follower. What does it mean to be a Christ follower? I don't feel like, from what I've read in the Gospels, I don't feel like I'm truly following. And it started to really bother me because I almost felt like, is it even possible to really follow? But there's a contradiction, there's a cognitive dissonance that exists. And I think as a result, people have redefined Christianity to Christ worshiper. And as long as you do your worship, you're good. So it kind of explains this obsession, because in early Christianity, there wasn't, like, you don't read in the Gospels and you hear about the huge worship services that Jesus was putting on the hill for all to come and sing, right? That wasn't the point. But yet in Christianity today, it does seem like it's the point. And the question is why? And I think it is because of that tingly dopamine experience. People are now associating that. They're associating that with the movement of the Spirit. And so, yes, I 100% experienced that frequently. And I believed that was Jesus or the Holy Spirit, I guess. Maybe it was the Holy Spirit. But, again, that's like, well, Jesus, Holy Spirit, God. It's, I was always told it was the Holy Spirit that created that feeling and sort of came down and sort of united the people in this experience, basically. So, yes, 100% felt that and believe that wholeheartedly, that was sort of the thing, right? Like if you're experiencing that means you're close to God.
Yeah.
And then of course, supplementing that with learning, reading the Bible and trying to be like Jesus, right? So we used to have those bracelets and it was like WWJD that we would wear, what would Jesus do? So it is, I was fine with it at the time. As time went on, the contradictions started to build up for me. But, when I was younger, it was just accepted that that was sort of the way it is. Yeah.
Hmm. Could I ask, what would you have said at that time as a, mid teenager? What would you have said was the ideal the life path for you at that point? Like if you could say, these are my core values today, if you would have used that kind of verbiage, I, hopefully believe in Jesus, believe in the word, want to serve him, want to honor him. What did living that out look like for you as you entered adulthood? If you had stayed, along the same path as a committed Christian, what did that look like to be an adult, you know, Christian, very much pleasing the Lord for with your gifts and talents?
I always wanted to be like a professional musician and like probably a drummer most of all, like in a big band. And actually, I was a good drummer, or I don't play as much these days just because all the Christian, all the context in which I played went away, right? When I left Christianity, it was like, oh, all my friends that played music no longer want to play with me. It's funny how that changed, but
So you would have
I
wanted to play like professionally for a church or a church Christian
I
band?
always had that dream. Yeah, I always had this dream that I would be kind of would find my way into that somehow. But
Hmm.
my parents also were quite. I was indoctrinated from a young age to be a doctor, actually, and I got good grades in school, and so I always just thought I would go to school and be a doctor. So I also wanted to help people that way. So yeah, all the way up until almost graduating high school, I wanted to be a doctor. At the last second, I switched to do computer science. But yeah, so I think that's sort of I kind of had this loose dream. I also did a lot of sports, and I always kind of had this loose dream of being a professional athlete too. So I don't know. You have all these dreams when you're a kid, but I do know that I wanted to be a musician. That was a big thing. I really, really enjoyed that.
Hmm. Did you have any interest in being a pastor or a missionary along the way?
I think at the time I was a bit of a shy person. I didn't like it's interesting now. Like I now talk on YouTube and I've kind of learned how to project myself in that way. But I think back then the thought of public speaking was so terrifying. So being a pastor wasn't something that I would probably it wasn't graft. I didn't feel that pull back then just because of how scary that would have felt to speak on stage. But I did a few missions trips and but I never, I think actually I felt a little stressed because of that as well. Actually, I always had this feeling like, oh no, what if I get called to be a missionary in Africa, right? Or like, what if it's so funny to think like I didn't want to do that, but I had this feeling like I might get called to do it, and then what do? I guess I have to go. I
Hmm.
did feel that like if because you people always would talk, oh, I got called to be this, I got called to be that. And I remember I used to wonder, well, how do you know that you were called? Do you like how do you because it goes back to that thing about being sure. I was always like, well, I think, God is telling me this. I think I feel good about that. But then I would sometimes wonder, well, is it possible that God is telling me to do something that I don't feel good about? I think that thing stressed me out a little bit. How do I know the difference between what I feel good about and what God is telling me to do? So, what if God calls me to Africa, but I don't really want to go? It's kind of like Jonah in the Bible. Jonah gets called to go do something that God wants him to do, and he doesn't do it, and then he gets eaten by a fish. It's sort of like, here's your punishment, Jonah. Um, yeah, I didn't want that to happen. So if I was called to do something, how would I know? Can I be sure that I'm called? I don't want to go do something like that unless I know for sure. Yeah, but I also just had this comfort that music was my thing and I was doing my job basically. because, you know, even from a very young age, like I was 15 years old playing in front of thousands of people sometimes.
Wow.
Um, and for some reason, I just I got good at the drums quickly. And so even as a 15-year-old, I was like a decent drummer. And then that moved on, and I eventually went to school. I went to school in Vancouver after I graduated. So that's, you know, UBC, University of British Columbia in Vancouver. When obviously Vancouver is a much bigger city. And I went to this like church that was like the best music church that I could find. And I quickly got on the worship teams, and I was playing with just some amazing musicians there. Like, you know, the one guy owned a studio, like a big studio in Vancouver, and I was playing with this really good bass player. He was doing a degree in bass at UBC, and he had this electric upright, and I love to play jazz. So when I wasn't doing worship music, I played jazz. And jazz was kind of like the pinnacle for me because it's such a complicated type of music. So anyway, at this church, that's where I met this guy, Will. He was from the UK, but he was doing his degree in bass. And so we would play jazz, and met some really good musicians there. There was this big club in Vancouver, and the house drummer, he also went to that church, and he taught me more things about performing live and playing in the pocket, and like things that maybe I hadn't learned in my little small town. So anyway, when I was going to university there, just really still into that, I became friends with the music pastor at that church. So that was a Pentecostal church. And in high school, actually, I went to Pentecostal church as well. So yeah, it was just right in there. I was on this one worship team with this girl, and then she actually went on to do more music. Anyway, it was a great place. I think that's the thing, is that I really did love that. And I made friends and had really good connections. And it's kind of one of the sad parts of it for me when I left, is that just dissipated.
Yeah.
And even when I came back to Kelowna, eventually I moved back here, and I still just played in some of the like best bands around, music worship bands. And so I always felt like, sorry, long answer to say, I felt like I was doing my thing. So I almost didn't feel like, oh no, what's my point? I was like, my point is to play music. So as long as the church, anyway.
Yeah, I definitely was gonna just piggyback off of one thing you said, and just that sense of, if the Lord, what if he calls me to do something I don't want to do? And I don't know how many people know this name as much now, but it used to be a more common name. But there's a lady who was she had an accident. Her name is Johnny Ericson Tata. She eventually became like a writer and wrote her books, you know, her story. But her story was that she was just like jumping on a rope swing or something into a little lake, and she accidentally didn't realize she was, you know, over a shallow area. And so when she was coming in the water, it was too shallow that she shouldn't have really been, you know, diving into it. And so it snapped her, something, she hit something, snapped her neck, and she was instantly quadriplegic, you know, and for the rest of her life, that's what she's been. I think she's still living, but she wrote in this book, you know, her life story about this. And as you look at this, it was almost like it was being crafted and being messaged to us as like, look, God will do whatever it takes to get your attention and to make you useful to him. And if you aren't keeping him completely in the center of your life and your focus, he may take things away, just like with, you know, with Job, how he, you know, takes away your house and your animals and eventually your kids. He'll take stuff away from you. But like John Action Tata, he might literally snap your neck to get your focus and to make you useful to him. And we used to see it as almost like a badge of honor. Like we would pray to God, God, do whatever it takes. I mean, whatever it takes to make me not have my eyes on this world and the things of this life, but to have my eyes focused on the kingdom, on heaven, on you, on the gospel, and saving people, on being holy and on fire for you, committed to you, useful to you. We want to be useful vessels. So God, do whatever it takes. We will try our best to keep our hands open to let you give and take away. But if we're doing it and we're somehow actually, we think we're doing it, we're not. It's like we're doing it in the flesh, or we're pretending, or there's some hidden sin in us. Do whatever it takes to crush us, to bring out that sweet savor, make us useful. And it was almost like with that example, the missionary thing you gave, like, God, if you're calling me to be a missionary, and there's a part of me that's saying, I really don't want to do that. But God's saying, no, no, that's the best life. That's the best. That's plan A. Plan A is, we can do this the easy way, easy way or the hard way. It almost becomes like a mafia boss, mob boss kind of conversation. Like, we'll do this the hard way or the easy way. The easy way is you let me direct your life. The hard way is I'll still direct your life, but I will break you through, your will. And those kind of stories, they terrified me too. It was like, what if God asked me to do something and I truly don't want to? And what I'm basically saying is, God, please start crushing me, because I know that's what's coming anyway. And that question of, am I willing to do it, to do things for God, or am I truly making this difficult on myself for no reason? And the outcome's going to be the same. I still do obey God. I still, like, the Jonah story you mentioned, I still go to Nineveh in the end, but I've messed up my life so much for no reason, wasted a bunch of time, and now it hurts so much more than it had to. And that dynamic went through my heart and my head so much too. I definitely can relate to it.
Yeah. And like along with that, I think one of the things that really bothers me the most today is, let's say, like it was like the girl, she broke her back, right? You said,
Yeah, her neck.
it's like if something good happens, it was God. If something bad happens, it was God. It's sort of like, it doesn't matter what happens, it's God. And it's sort of like people use any event as evidence for God. And I started to ask the question, this is later, obviously. Is there anything that could happen that isn't evidence for God? And I actually started to ask that to other Christians. Is there anything that could happen at all? Let's say your kids die. Is that evidence that God doesn't have your back? They're like, oh no, that just means God's using. I mean, it's awful to think about, is reality. Oh, God killed my kids to teach me a lesson, or something like that. Oh, now I can go and do what he really wants me to do. Or now I'll learn this amazing lesson through watching my child suffer and die, that now I'll be able to help other people or comfort other people as their children suffer and die. I don't know. I hate that. But yeah, it is that attitude of, if something good happened, God did it. If something bad happened, well, that's according to his will. And, it's like, interesting. So, children suffering and dying is part of God's will. And then you sort of, if you phrase it in that way, they're like, well, no, it's the sin doing it. It's the fallen man, and it's like the sin that's entered the world. That's what's doing that. Well, but God's using it. Like, God uses a bad experience, but he didn't cause it. And it's like,
Mental
this really
gymnastics
started
we
to
go
bother
through.
me. It's this idea, do we have free will or not? So if God swoops in at various moments and removes our free will, I started to see the consequences of free will. If God swoops in to fix the consequence of free will, that is removing free will. So if you go and do something really stupid, and then there's a consequence, and then God fixes that or helps you or changes that in some way, you pray for a new job and you get it. It's like, the idea of this, Christians always assume we have free will, but it really started to mess with my mind. It seems like the will of God goes against our free will. It's like, do we have free will or not? And I remember that used to really confuse me. And I guess and then Calvinism. And so that's when I started to learn about, well, Calvinism or all these various philosophies. Well, in Calvinism, you don't really have free will, almost. It's like though I didn't go to Bible school, so I hope I have these things right, but I was taught, with Calvinism, you're basically a dead body on the ground. And it's not God necessarily calling to you and you standing up. It's more like he picks you up off the ground.
Yeah.
And he chooses the fact that you will have life again as a dead body. So in that sense, it sort of seems like God is picking who is saved. That's what Calvinism seems like to me. God is picking who is saved. You don't
Yeah, for
really
sure.
have the choice, which that seems pretty awful. So people that aren't chosen have no chance to become saved. So
And they're
I
still
think what's
condemned for it. They have no
I think what's
chance, but
most
they're still
interesting is
condemned.
I started to realize that most Christians, as time went on, I was educating myself. It's almost like most Christians that I knew had no idea what I was talking about. I would say you went up today and said to somebody, hey, what do you think about Calvinism? They wouldn't have any idea. Maybe if you went to Bible school, you probably wouldn't know these things. But
Yeah, you're right on target. I think I would just add one of the confusing things too for me about that whole discussion of what is, God's will is what is he responsible for, that I always found it confusing and difficult to deal with the question of what is God's will specifically for you. Because like let's say, and I've used this illustration before, but like let's say you're metaphorically knocking on the door, God, I want to go to this college. This college seems like the right path for me. And you just get this sense of peace and conviction, like, yes, God is saying, please go to that college. That's where I've got you. I've got great things in store for you. Go there. And then you get denied. Your application's denied. We don't want you to come here. Well, you're like, wait, God, you were clearly putting it on my heart and you gave me peace. I was waiting for the peace that passes all understanding, and you gave it to me. So what is the peace that what is that for? And so you end up with the question of, number one, you misunderstood. So you're totally backwards on the peace thing. You're thinking, goosebumps on your arm are God's peace or something. So you're misunderstanding God. Or it could be Satan. Satan's trying to thwart it. Like God really does want you to go to that college, and he just wants you to work harder to overcome this satanic oppression. Or it's God testing you, where he's like saying, you are going to go there, just not in this time, and you're going to go a year later, but keep pushing it and you'll realize what I'm doing. But I'm kind of testing your faith. This is to see if you're willing to believe me, that it's not a yes or no only, it's wait. And so you get all, and there's probably a few other dynamics you could throw in there, but all these questions. And eventually, for a lot of us, I think it became very confusing to say, well, if God opens up the door, is that him, or is that me in the flesh opening up a door? Or is that Satan opening up the door that Satan wants me to go down? He's trying to make it real easy, but God would actually rather me not do that. And vice versa, when the door slams in your face, was it Satan or God or me? I remember endless questions. And I personally got to a point where I was like, I don't know why even struggle that much to pursue the will of God? Because number one, it gets slammed in my face so much. I think he's opening doors and then he doesn't. It's like, what was that about? But then it seems like he's just like toying with me, like he's this really wicked puppet master. And I got very, very overwhelmed by those thoughts. Does that resonate at all with you?
oh yeah, it reminds me of this one specific thing that happened. So I know a guy, he's from Miami actually, and he went to Calvary Chapel Bible College in California, and he married somebody that I know up here. So then he moved up to Kelowna, and it was his thing. Well, actually, they moved to Vernon, which is this place it's about a 45-minute drive away from Kelowna. It's a little bit of a smaller city, but there was a Calvary Chapel in Kelowna, but he wanted to start one in Vernon. And he felt like that was his point to coming up here, starting this Calvary Chapel. And I remember asking about it. And it was like he felt called by God. It was so obvious to him. There was no question in his mind. This was his calling. This was his mission. He's going to come up here and basically shake this town up, basically, and make some waves with this church he's going to plant. And well, guess what? It didn't really work, and nobody really wanted to go. And so it started off small, but he was quite young at the time, I remember, and he just didn't have the maturity and experience to be leading a large group of people like that. And to me, from the very beginning, I thought, this isn't working. But he was so sure, and he's the one that went to Bible college. I didn't go to Bible college. He says he's hearing the Lord's voice. And then in the end, he gave up. And then he went to Kelowna and worked for the Calvary Chapel. It didn't work out. And that was a number of years ago now. So I think he's sort of given up on that. It goes back to your point. What was the point of that? If God, so I actually asked him one time, do you believe you heard the word of God wrong, or the voice of God? Did God tell you that as some kind of a test or a lesson, and then it didn't work out? Or did you just hear it wrong? I think that's a very difficult question for most Christians, and they can't answer that. The problem is this like this cognitive bias that comes about and turns every struggle, every bad thing into the right path, and it was the way it was supposed to be. And that sort of goes back to my point. It seems like, well, God just can't do wrong. Anything can happen, and it's the right path. So, yes.
Like you're saying with cognitive biases, and it's like there's always a way to explain it. And I remember too, just in terms of the theology stuff with Calvinism and other things, there was also this dynamic we had woven in of, if you are struggling with understanding some aspect of God, of his nature, of what he's doing, or even of interpreting some passage in scripture, you need to understand that generations and generations of people have struggled with this, and good, wonderful men and women of God have researched this, and they have answers that satisfied the deepest questions of their souls, and their strength, their faith got stronger and stronger. So what you need is to follow in their footsteps, trust for today, but keep studying, because eventually you will learn that some of the secrets and the research and just understanding, putting the pieces together, you'll get there. And so you need to read more of the theologians and the great pastors, your Calvins, your Spurgeons, all the great Puritans. You need to read the great masters of theology, and they will help you iron out these questions. And it became like this group of people to like aspire to be like them and to think their thoughts after them. And this sense of like, someday, if you just have faith for today, but you put in the hard work, God will reveal the answers. But at the end, the final conclusion we know will be, there are no real discrepancies here. There are no real issues. This was all clearly God at work, and it was all God clearly sending a unified message. You just misunderstood it along the way. He'll clear it up. And in worst case, he will clear it up in heaven. You'll get to heaven and it'll be like, oh God, if I'd known all this, I would have never questioned you. This was so amazing. Nice. I mean, just beautiful work. Jesus, this is crazy good. And so it was always like, just wait. You'll get your answers one way or the other, and they will be beautiful when they arrive. And you'll just, like Job, when it's done, you'll stop arguing. You'll put your hand over your mouth and say, God, I close my mouth. I repent. You are the King. I worship you. And that dynamic got so prevalent that you almost get tempted to stop asking the questions on a serious level, because it's like, just trust God. I mean, goodness, stop being so like anxious for the answers. Just trust him. He's a good father. Let him be good to you. And all the while, it's like they're just burying these questions. It's like the Wizard of Oz. Just ignore the man behind the curtain. He's not there. And it's like, eventually, you get to a point where you're like, okay, this push to just wait for the answers. It's actually a tactic. It's a tactic that's trying to get you to not see, this actually doesn't add up. This doesn't make sense. And the splinter in your mind, it's not a facade. It's really there, and you need to do something about it. This isn't your immaturity in faith and spirituality. This is a real issue. But they just, they kind of blur it away and try to get you to ignore it. It's crazy, the gymnastics you go through.
Yeah. Well, there's two things that I could say to that. The first is, yes, carrot and the stick argument. That's what I call that. You got a carrot dangling, and it's like in front of your face, and you keep moving towards it. It just keeps getting further away. And it's this promise of getting it, but you never do. That is the basis of Christianity, unfortunately, is what I've noticed. It's like, you don't have it now, but you will. You gotta seek God. You gotta study more. You gotta pray more, and you'll get there. You'll get closer. But then eventually you're like, well, I've done this for 20 years. I'm not getting it. And it's interesting on the comments on that Christianity video I made. I've made a couple of them, but there is so much of that. Well, you just need to seek God. You just need to, I get messages from people. It was my birthday recently, and I got this message from someone. They're like, happy birthday, and then a sermon. And it's like,
wow,
all this carrot and the stick argument. And at a certain point, I have to say to that argument, I'm like, okay, so what, for almost 30 years, was I doing it wrong? Is that what you're saying? I was doing it wrong. I tried everything I had, uh, everything that I was taught. I did all this studying, all this research, and I couldn't figure it out. But what? There's still something that I haven't figured out. Like, what is it? But then you never get to the core of it. You can't. So that, I guess that was the first response I had you there, that carrot and the stick. But the other thing you said, so there was, so in my kind of mid to late 20s, a lot of these problems started to compound for me. I started to notice the difference between what Jesus said and what Christians were doing and how they were living. And I started to ask the question, is it possible to be a Christian? I was very confused. I go to regular church and I was just like spinning because I wanted to stand up and ask questions as the pastor speaking, because there's a lot of things they were saying that just didn't make sense. I'm like, what do you mean by this? What do you think about this? Well, how you resolve this contradiction that appears to be here? Anyway, so I found this guy named Bruxy Cavey. Have you heard of him?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, he runs a really large church in Ontario, Canada.
Okay.
So that's on the other side of the country from me, but I've never actually been over there. But he's got all these podcasts and videos, and he's quite well known. He's wrote a book called The End of Religion, which is a pretty popular book. Anyway, I found him, and there's this thing he taught me, and some kind of a quote, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was, a skilled teacher can make the Bible say anything, is basically what it's saying, with the combination of cultural context, metaphor, and literal interpretation, right? So, you go to a church and they're happy to take certain things as literal. But then if something's inconvenient, like, hey, a verse about slavery, oh, that's cultural context. That was for the people at the time. Obviously, that's not for us today because we don't have slaves. And then metaphor, it's like something that is completely, out of context for us. Oh, we can take this as a metaphor for this. So like with these three tools, you can kind of just craft your own narrative with the Bible. And so the reason why I liked him is I just started devouring his podcast. I was like, I'd mowing the lawn, I'm listening to Bruxy. I'm driving, I'm listening to Bruxy. I just couldn't stop listening. He had 4 or 5 years worth of podcasts. I think I listened to all of them within, 6 months or something. This is all I was listening to at the time, and trying. And it was the first person that made it. He must think a little bit like me, just a little more logical. It was helping, but it started to make me feel like I was almost treating him like this guru and everybody else had it wrong, which I also know is a little dangerous because that's almost like cult-like thinking. It's like, here is this one guy that has it right. And so I couldn't go to regular church anymore. I remember he came to Kelowna once to speak, and I went, and I actually sent him a couple emails, and he wrote back, and I just really, for a time, it was helping. And he disagrees with a lot of what's going on in Christianity. So that was perfect for me because I didn't feel so alone. I felt like, oh, I can still be a Christian, because all Christianity has sort of turned into this monster, is what how I described it. Christianity is this monster that is not what it's supposed to be. So I started to really research what did the early church look like? What did Christianity look like for the first couple 100 years? What are the things they did? And I sort of, and Bruxy was a big part of that because he talks a lot about the early church and the way things were. And I just began to realize that, okay, that's why I feel so weird. And that's why so many things aren't making sense, is because the church has drifted from what the early church was. But, the problem is that worked for a while, but then I even started to go be deeper than that, looking more into the the origin of the Gospels and the writers of the Gospels. And, you know, and then I sent Bruxy some more emails, and I remember this one I sent. It was basically, he wrote back and said, yeah, I don't really have an answer for that. And I remember that was the moment I realized, okay, my guru here doesn't have all the answers either. One of the things that really threw me for a loop was the Gospels themselves, the writers of the Gospels. And I just always assumed that the Gospels were written by the disciples. It's funny, even when I ask many Christians today that question, they think that. And religious scholars almost, even like Christian religious scholars, they all agree that the authors of the Gospels are anonymous. They were written numerous years after Jesus' death, in a different language, in a far-off land. Well, maybe not a far-off land, but a different land. They were not eyewitnesses that wrote the Gospels. So the person who wrote Matthew was not Matthew. He wasn't there. So, okay, Bruxy, the way he reconciled this was, well, the oral tradition was so strong in those times, and people kept that tradition and told those stories. But then I started to learn, Bart Ehrman has been an interesting resource for me. Have you read any of, he's got
quite a bit
of books, obviously. It's hard to miss Bart Ehrman.
Yeah, he's awesome.
But I was always taught that the Bible is inerrant, and it's the inspired word of God, and it's true. And one of the things that really confused me, obviously, was well, what about the Old Testament? It says all kinds of stuff that seems to contradict the New Testament. It was actually Bruxy that solved that contradiction for me. It's, if you look at the Bible more like this is sort of the story. If you look at the Bible more like a story, the Old Testament is kind of this description of what didn't work, and then Jesus is the solution. So if you look at it like this story, now it starts to make sense, and you sort of look at the Old Testament as still God's word, but also allowing us as humans to figure out that our way doesn't work. Now Jesus is the new covenant. To be honest, that did satisfy me somewhat. But I think what really threw me for a loop is when Buxley started, he actually believes the Bible isn't inerrant, which is one of the first pastors, I think, that I had heard say that. And I was quite confused and a little mind blown when he said that. That was a problem for me, I remember, because it's like, well, how do you know which are the parts that are errors, right? Okay, you're taking this as literal truth. Well, how do you know that's not the error? I still almost believe that it's a bit of a problem for Christianity. Either you have to believe the Bible is inerrant and it's true, and then you can actually take all this stuff as truth. But if you believe it is inerrant, I think that opens up a massive problem, because, oh, how convenient that the parts that are wrong, the parts that aren't, are the human error that have been introduced into the text. How are you supposed to know? So it was actually Bart Ehrman, I started researching all these things with Bart Ehrman, that I guess the parable of casting the first stone. I'm not a religious scholar, so don't take anything I have to say as truth. But this was one thing that I had read, was the casting of the first stone parable, which is a great parable, very convenient for Christians, right? Wasn't they, in the earliest manuscript that they found, it wasn't in there. So this parable had been added. And that is a big problem for me. It's like, oh, so we don't have the earliest manuscripts. We have copies from centuries later. These things were apparently written 40, the earliest gospel, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, somewhere in there. That the Christians will say, oh no, it was more like 20 or 30 years after, but still, it's a long time.
Yeah, in different language. And like you said too, other issues, variations in text. It's like, well, where do you know, like, when was the extra stuff added and who added that? And how do you know if that happened, like say 50 years after the first version was out there? How do you know that there wasn't an earlier version of the one we did get? Like if you take away the stoning story, how do you know that there wasn't an earlier version that didn't have part of that in it? It's like there's no way to know. It's crazy.
I know. And then, another thing that Bartman says that I've just been reading recently that I thought was interesting, or watching some of his videos, but maybe, John was the last gospel to be written, and it was quite late. And it used the other gospels as a source, but now it's been more embellished. So, one of the topics I was listening to recently is, did Jesus claim to be the Son of God? Because through YouTube and the videos I've made, I get a lot of messages from all different types of people. I had a Jehovah's Witness for a while. There's just constant, kind of debate going on for months, or quite a few Muslims as well I've talked to. And the Muslims don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. It started me questioning, well, why do Christians think that Jesus is the Son of God? Well, it turns out a lot of the stuff comes from John. And John was written so much later. It used the other gospels as a source, and it embellished a lot of Jesus's claims of being divine. You look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and it's not so clear that Jesus claimed he was the Son of God. Anyway, this is one of the biggest problems for me, because it's like, what is Christianity? It is essentially a book club. Without the Bible, you don't really have a lot. All you have is these spiritual concepts of God, and really it becomes whatever you want it to be. So you kind of need some kind of grounding. Well, that's the Bible. Well, then, is the Bible reliable? It kind of seems to me that the Bible isn't reliable. It seems like if Christianity is based on the Bible, but the Bible is more about trusting people than it is about trusting God. And it turns out that I'm a little skeptical of people. I'm not the most trusting person. I do trust people, but I don't trust easily. So, that's a huge problem for me. That's where it all started to go downhill for me, was when I realized that maybe the Bible isn't as reliable as I thought, and that I have to trust this oral tradition was passed on. I have to trust all these powerful men along the way. Well, guess what? It seems like powerful men often are manipulating things. So, yeah.
I completely can echo that stuff. And I think even add to it, the Gospel of Mark, we know that it had at least it had at least 9 different endings, because we have them, we have at least 9 different endings of the Gospel of Mark. And I think too, for me, it was helpful to learn that there weren't just 4 Gospels and many versions of those 4 Gospels, but there actually are at least 60 that we know of. And it's been well argued that there probably originally were several hundred Gospels, and some of them may have had their own versions amongst themselves. So we may have literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Gospels, but yet we've got these 4, and we're going to call them inspired. Like, why were there originally at least 60 and probably hundreds? Why did we get these 4? Why are there variations? Why don't we know who wrote them? And it really does, to me too. I love the expression scope for the imagination. Is from a kid's series of books called Anne of Green Gables. I used to love it as a kid, reading the books and watching the movie. But it's this girl with a great imagination, young orphan girl. So she just, she'd see a lake, and instead of it, someone else would call it the official boring name of whatever the lake is called, and she'd be like, "Oh no, that's the Lake of Shining Waters." She'd come up with these grand names, and she'd had her imagination just took over. But that phrase, scope for the imagination, really grabbed my mind as I was deconverting, to think Christians by and large have no scope for the imagination to think, just what if it's a little different, and what if it's a lot different than what you're thinking happened? And what if there were originally hundreds of Gospels? What if we know there's at least 60? What if originally these Gospels were plays? We knew they were doing plays for Dionysius and all these other, Euripides, Bacchae. We know they had theaters in Greek where they were doing these plays for their gods, what if the Gospels were originally just plays and they were editing them? And the reason there's versions is they were doing different plays in different towns and changing it up to see what worked. Maybe there's a reason for this stuff. It doesn't mean that's what it was, but it's like, just what if? And
Mhm.
what if the Apostle Paul was really quite a jerk? What if you met him, you'd think he's more of a terrorist, these days, and a wacko than a good guy? Like, just what if, what if, what if? And as you ask these
I mean,
more what
and I'm
ifs,
not even sure you have to ask that because he was literally killing people before he
yeah,
became a Christian. So it's like, obviously, wasn't a great guy. I would just
yeah,
say it's not even a what if. He clearly wasn't a great guy. I am not killing people, right? Like you are not killing people, and then Christianity fixed you to not kill people. Um, so
yeah, I agree. And and why in the book of was it Galatians, why is it clear that Paul is so opposed to the Jerusalem leaders? And maybe, why were they so opposed to him, and why weren't they talking more? And why didn't the original disciples write all these books? And you keep on adding to these questions in addition to comparative mythology, and you end up with this big thought of like, oh my gosh, this whole thing could have started and evolved in hundreds of ways that we're completely oblivious to. It's just lost to time, but it could have been something so different. And even the Jesus character himself, he could have been so different to the point that if you could actually somehow have a time machine and go back to see him, you'd think, wait, that's Jesus? That's the guy that started this? Like he's weird and he's nasty to people and he's literally like doing bad things. And you're like, you have no idea how this thing really started and evolved, and yet you're basing your whole life on it. And to me, once you realize some of those basic things and start to go down the rabbit trails, it's like, come on, you're basing your life on a possibility that this is a good story and a good book that has been fully preserved, like you're saying, with the inerrancy and all that. You're not in any way allowing that this might be just a very human book. And yet, even though that's they're ignoring it, the idea that it's just a human book is kind of, the evidence is all over the place.
yeah, I think my current thought is that I mean, if I just had to guess, but it's not like a proclamation. I think there probably was. I think Jesus probably was real, and he was just this countercultural thinker, and he's sort of that guru type. I mean, did he claim to be God? I actually really question that now after doing some research into it. I mean, I there's that one verse which I'm probably completely paraphrasing, just basically where he had said that the kingdom of God will return before the end of his followers' lives. Right? Like, do you know the reference for that?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, it seems, I mean, these are the kinds of verses I'm like, are you guys reading this? Obviously, Jesus thought that the kingdom of heaven was coming very soon. We were in the end times
Yeah,
back then. Um, he wasn't saying that he's going to die and then 2,000 years later this whole rigmarole is still going to be going on. It seems to me that Jesus didn't, he was either wrong, but then this is just what's written down. I'm surprised they didn't take that out actually along the way,
yeah,
but I suspect that he was a guy. He recognized there was problems in the Jewish religion. He probably saw all kinds of corruption and things. He sort of gained this following. Um, and he probably had some good messages and he had some good values, but it's taking that and then the claims of being God. I can't even really be sure that he made that claim. But even if he did make the claim that he was God, well, there's lots of people throughout history that have claimed to be God. Just because he said that doesn't mean he is God. So,
yeah. 100%.
um, I another problem that I have. I mean, I have all kinds of problems, and most of them are logical problems. Is what I've noticed and so a lot of people don't think super logically, is what I've begun to realize. So, but the whole idea, like I was always taught that I'm supposed to be like super appreciative to Jesus for dying for my sins. Like, and I remember this time, it was quite a while ago. And I remember I think I said to somebody, it doesn't really seem like that big of a deal. I mean, I would die for one person that I care about, maybe. Like, especially my kids right now. If one of my kids was in trouble, I would die for them without thinking too much. If I had the opportunity to die for the whole world, well, it's kind of a no-brainer. I'd just do it, right? So I think a lot of people would die for the whole world. So I started to wonder, well, is it that special that he died for the whole world? And just asking that question, I remember the person I was talking to got super offended. The other thing is, I'm like, well, did he even die? He went home to where he was. It'd be like, I was actually trying to think of an analogy the other day of what it would be like. It'd be like I put VR goggles on, I go into a game, I've inserted myself into a game, which is essentially what God did. He has inserted himself into this, which is what? It's sort of almost like a virtual reality thing that he's made on top of whatever platform existence is. So he's created this world for us. He inserted himself into it, just like putting on some VR goggles. He does all this stuff, but for some reason doesn't record his own words properly. I mean, that part really bothers me. If, like Marcus Aurelius, for example, in the book Meditations, kind of the main book for Stoics. Well, it's comforting to read because Marcus Aurelius wrote the book. These are actually his words. They're translated, but at least he wrote them, right? With Jesus, it's like if he was coming to earth, why wouldn't he write down his own words? I mean, that's a huge problem for me. I think the reality is he didn't feel like he had to because he didn't know that this was going to happen, that his teachings were going to be written down and become this huge thing. Thousands of years later, people are still following. I don't think he knew that was going to happen. But, let's say for a second that God did do that. God did put himself into a man, but not really a man, fully God and fully man, which again, I have problems with. It's like, well, it's like being fully dog and fully cat. You can't be both things. That's the point. If you are all one thing, then you aren't the other thing. It's sort of like being heads and tails. I have a real problem thinking about that. Fully God and fully man. I remember even at a young age, I used to be quite confused with this fully God and fully man. Or the idea of the Trinity. It's that Jesus is God and God is the Holy Spirit. Oh, it's like an egg, the yolk and the shell I'm like, oh yeah, okay. Kind of like, that was the story I was told when I was young. It's like an egg. But anyway, God puts himself into the game. Let's just call this the game, because that's all it could be at this point. Like, what kind of a game is this? If God actually created this on purpose, he can tell the future. So he knew it was going to happen. He knew that Eve would eat the apple and then give it to Adam, and there'd be this fall of man. Well, to me, that sounds like writing a program, because I'm a programmer. That sounds like writing a program and that the program is going to fail. You've inserted a bug into the program. You have the choice now, because what's going to happen. You have the choice to fix the bug, but you don't. So it's going to happen. These human beings that you've created are destined for failure. At this point, I really question, I can only assume if you can tell the future, then essentially he did it on purpose. So he did it on purpose. God intentionally created these flawed humans that were destined to fail. He then has to send, he's so disgusted with the humans that he created on purpose, that he now has to send his son that is also him. It's like he's put himself into this thing. And in the end, he dies in the game, but is resurrected. But he doesn't stay in the place where everybody can see it. And so he died and he came back to life, but then he immediately went to the place where dead people go. And so this confused me. Well, if he's risen, why is he where the dead people are? He's in heaven with all the dead people. That sounds like not being risen.
And you could add too, in certain theological understandings of it, that he didn't really even stay dead at all. He died and immediately went down to hell for 3 days. Like some people see it that way, and it's like,
Yeah.
and I love those. I know memes aren't the best way to get your theology or your philosophy, but it's like if you're the kind of character in the story that has existed forever and ever and ever, and you're going to exist forever and ever and ever in the future, and for like forever is something we can't even conceptualize. And like you said, it's a VR game that you're going to die for 3 days, or at least you're going to die in the sense of you're going to die for a millisecond and go to the VR version of hell. But you know that you've been alive forever and ever and ever in a way that we can't even conceptualize. You're going to be alive forever. These 3 days, or this millisecond that you go through this pain and then you go to hell for 3 days, like that is such a blink of an eye that as God is going to be a blink of an eye to you. You're timeless. So it's like you didn't, as the memes say, like you gave up a weekend for to save the world. You knew it was just a brief, painful weekend, and that's all it was. And you knew it would all be glorious when it was over. That it doesn't make sense. It absolutely doesn't make sense.
No. And it's kind of like it's like the thing that people say. It's like God sent himself to sacrifice himself to appease himself for the system that he created. It's like, why does he need a blood sacrifice? Why? He's God. He can make it however he wants. Why have Satan running rampant, causing all these problems? If God's all powerful, he might as well just end Satan. Why don't just give the poor humans some peace, and the suffering? Instead, it's like the reason why God doesn't kill Satan is because God doesn't work without Satan. If everybody went to heaven, it's like humans don't accept that. Humans need to be part of a club. They need there to be an adversary. So if everybody just went to heaven and we didn't have to do anything, I mean, that's a pretty boring religion. So
Yeah,
it's not
well
a
said.
coincidence that every single religion kind of follows this pattern. It's like there's always us, there's always them, there's always a hero, there's always an enemy, and we are fighting that enemy. I mean, maybe some of the Eastern religions don't necessarily have that. It seems a little more peaceful, but then maybe they're not even religions. Like, is Buddhism a religion? Maybe not.
I just want to say I really appreciate your sharing that particular part of it. It's a great way to put it, and I think the VR illustration is gold. And this the sense, like you said, that we doing a little bit of post-mortem on this, saying now that we know it's mythology, what does this say about humanity? Well, it says we need, like you said, a club, we need an antagonist, we need some kind of story, we need something to say there's this complication. What's going to happen? Oh no, how's it going to work? Oh, God's going to solve it. Bam, we've got a solution. We're into the resolution phase. And just we need this storyline to feel good about ourselves and to feel like we're doing something, and to, I guess you could say, to fight the nihilism, to fight the emptiness that would otherwise be there. But at the end of the day, it's a really interesting story, but it's just mythology, and it follows clear other mythologies that are very, very, very similar, and arguably ones that we actually see Christianity in many ways mimicking and copying. And it's like it's mythology, people. Like at some point, you have to break it down enough to say, not just does this make sense, does it make sense that God can't just forgive without blood, but just to say, but what actually is this story? Not does it make sense, but where did it come from? What is it? And I think one of the best things for me was just finally getting well educated enough in the mythology behind it all to say, whether I can explain it away and come up with really good reasons that this had to be this way, even though it doesn't make sense at first glance, but God had to do it this way. And maybe with more information that would make sense. It's like, wait a second. Instead of trying to explain it all away for myself, which I was doing for years, I mean, years and years of it, just to say, where did this thing come from? What is it copied from? And once I realized that, it was like the cat's out of the bag, as they say, and you're just like, oh my gosh, this is just another Dionysius. This is another Zeus. This is another Hermes. This is another Helios. This is just another God story. And it's amazing. Once you've, opened a few of those secret doors, the whole house of cards starts to fall. And I did want to bring it on that note back to your story. when you started to realize that some of this stuff wasn't adding up and you're learning more and more, you're studying more and more, I know that we're talking about it in one sense intellectually, but there's also this emotional component of like, oh my gosh, what if this isn't real? Like, what is real then? And what do I do with my life now? And, have I been talking to the wall? All this time I thought I was talking to God. Have I been talking to the drywall? How did you process the emotional side of the deconstruction where you weren't necessarily out yet, but just like, this has implications. These ideas have consequences. And this is going to maybe, arguably at that point, someone could say this is going to a very dark place if this is any, in any sense, true that this might be mythology.
I couldn't go to regular church anymore. And I felt fine about it because basically Brooks was even confirming for me that normal churches they're screwed. There's something wrong with them. They're obviously broken. They're doing something other than following Jesus. So I'm not going there anymore. But I would still call myself a Christian. It's funny, I meet a number of people that are in that phase. It's like they don't know how to reconcile the problems. And then I think what happens is they blame the current system of Christianity for the problems, but it's still there. We can go back to the early church. Jesus is still there. It's just that, it's been manipulated a little bit. So I ended up at this place called Metro. I talked about this in my other video as well, but Metro in Kelowna is actually this really cool place. So it is a church technically, but it is more about helping people on the street. So you go to that church on Sunday morning, it's at least half street people. People are on drugs. People are withdrawing from drugs in the middle of the service. There's a lot of effort put into helping people because, it actually really educated me while I was there. Like I realized that half the people on the street have brain injuries. So, and the attitude, even from Christians, they go to these big, like this church I used to play at in Kelowna. I mean, Kelowna is not even a big city, and this church has a $1 million media budget per year. This is how much money is spent on sound systems and productions. And I'm sure if you went to some of the larger churches, in the States or elsewhere, like it's probably even huger. But I remember thinking $1 million. And yet all these people are on the street. It's like they don't even have a shelter in the back of the church. I remember it just started to really bother me. Like, here's Jesus, is help feed the poor, help the hungry, and like help people, basically. Jesus wasn't hanging out with the cool people. He was hanging out with like tax collectors and prostitutes. So I was like, I'm going to go to Metro and hang out with those people instead. So ended up there. And I met really great people there because there's a lot of, I almost called them tired Christians is sort of all the people there are like that. And they're literally the best people best Christians I'd met. They're actually helping people. And their motto is leave judgment at the door. So, I remember one time when I was maybe, mid-teens, some guy came into the church. So that was a Pentecostal church. And right in the middle of the sermon, this loud guy kind of comes through the door. He's obviously some kind of disability or maybe some kind of brain injury or something. But he's all being loud and talks and like he comes to the front and like he's just wandering around. And like the elders come and quickly and like usher him out of the church, right? So that kind of thing would never happen at Metro. They would just be like, they just like, hey, how's it going? And then you want to come sit down with me over here. And like, it's like embracing people, right? So here's people. So what they thought, what I thought, so this is a bit of an aside, but their philosophy wasn't people on the street aren't poor monetarily. Of course they are, but the government, at least in Canada, gives them money. It just so happens that most of that money goes to drugs within 24 hours. They call it Welfare Wednesday. So I'm not sure what they call it in the United States, but in Canada, they call it welfare. Basically, if you're down and out, you can get a bit of money. But on the people on the street just goes to drugs right away. So it's like this madhouse of drugs. So the Metro, the real problem was this Welfare Wednesday, because everybody with their money drugs, everybody's on drugs, and then everybody's withdrawing all at once as they ran out of money and can't buy drugs anymore. So it was sort of helping these people. And their motto was, people aren't poor monetarily, people are poor in relationship. And I started to see how Christians treated these people, and it started to disgust me. Here are the people that are supposed to be helping, and they're not. If you look in the past, it was the church's job. Like, even if you look at Middle Ages or like 1500s, 1600s, from what I can tell from my research, it was like the church kind of took care of these people a little more, and they like almost gave them permits to beg and stuff. And it was sort of like all under the church. It was like the church's job. It seems like we've lost that. But I was in a Bible study with the leaders of the church and a bunch of the board members and stuff like that. Some of these people were amazing, and actually still one of my probably better friends today I met in that context. And so, he's one of the few people that have actually stayed friends with me when I left Christianity, which is a real shame. And I have so much I could say about that as well, the aftermath of it all and what happened. But I was going to this Bible study, and this was near the end for me. I was just a troublemaker, that is the reality in this Bible study. They're trying to have their Bible study, and I just kept bringing up all these problems and topics. And I remember this one time I had been researching hell, and I had learned that there was actually 3 different versions of hell at one point, the 3 different ideas about what hell could be. And now, in today's age, we kind of adopted the eternal torment theory. But there was other versions, and I started bringing this up to the Bible study. And one of them is you just cease to exist. So that was one of the theories of hell. And it really wasn't that you burned in hell forever. It was just eternal death. Simple as that. Eternal death. It's funny how eternal death has become eternal torture. And I remember this one girl, she said, she kind of stopped me, and because she could tell that I was so stressed out about this thing that I've been told my whole life. I was almost offended, because I was like, how many people are Christians and doing what they do because they're so scared of hell? And she's like, well, why does it matter? Why are you even talking about this? Like, why don't we get back to the good fuzzy things about Christianity? And I'm like, this is everything to me. So she thought it didn't matter, but I was like, this is everything. I need to know the answer. Is hell real? Is hell manufactured? The other theory of hell, which I'd never even heard, was maybe you go to this place and you could work your way out of it. And there was people that actually believed that in the early church, and there was sort of these 3 ideas. And it really turned out that Jesus didn't really talk about hell that much. And when you actually look into it, it's very unclear, just like everything else. But yet, the Christians and the church has made it into these doctrines, right? So, eventually there's a whole other side of this, and that is my marriage. So we married young. The whole purity culture thing really, really got a hold of me. I was terrified to date, even. Like, you remember that book? That's like, there was that book. What's the book called?
I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that guy, I think it's funny, because I think maybe, what was it, like a few years ago, he came out and basically renounced the whole book. Yeah. And I'm just like, thanks a lot. You have no idea really how much that shaped the culture in which I grew up anyway. But I remember I was just so scared to date, and my mom had really indoctrinated me about sex and the idea that if I had sex before marriage, that was going to harm my relationships. That was going to harm my marriage. Basically, God will reward me if I basically save myself till marriage. I was also really indoctrinated about, alcohol, which maybe that's not the worst thing in the world, but I never drank a drop. I actually wasn't even drunk until I was about 29. And that was because I was literally forced to in China. I had people holding me down and pouring alcohol in my mouth. That was the only reason I ever actually felt being drunk. Which is a whole nother story, this insane experience I had in China. But yeah, I remember I met her, and I had a very emotionally volatile upbringing. I think it really colored the relationship that I ended up in. It was based on Christianity. And then I remember just being pressured so much to get married. It's like, I remember my dad telling me, well, you either break up or you get married. And I was like, well, I guess I don't really want to break up. But I didn't actually have sex until I was married, which maybe Christians would say, yay, good for you. You did it. But I don't see it as good now, actually. My ideas on all that stuff has completely changed, which again is a whole nother topic I could talk about. I'll try to stick to the story though. So anyway, yeah, I think our marriage was sort of based on shared values and all this religious stuff. So, over time, as I become more rebellious towards the ideas that are handed to me, really started to put a lot of stress on relationship. And I think that's just an unfortunate truth. Is as you move away and your values change. I mean, a lot of relationships seem like they can't survive difference in values.
Sure.
Like, could a fundamentalist Christian and like a hardcore Muslim be in a relationship? They probably could if they were both very mature and they understood that the other person's beliefs are not their own beliefs. But I think a lot of people probably can't do that well. So it really just started to put a lot of strain on the relationship. And, the problem is her family too was very, I call them mystical Christians. So they would actually consider themselves progressive in a way. But it's just very spiritual and very hearing the word of God style of Christianity, where it's almost like, oh, God told me this, God told me that, so I can just do these things. Oh, God gave me a word. Oh, God gave me a prophecy. And I remember there was this night. So we were actually, we used to do quite a bit of traveling down the West Coast at a motorhome, and I love to surf and kite surf. So we'd often get in the motorhome and just drive. In Canada, there's good spots all the way down to Washington, Oregon, into California. So we actually drove down to California, and we were in Oceanside, California, and her parents came over. And they had just gone to Bethel. You know Bethel?
Bethel, yeah, I do know that.
Yeah, it's somewhere in California. What is that? Is it Redding or something like that?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, Redding.
Right.
And they had spent a couple days there, and they were so fired up and like on that complete spiritual high. And the problem is so I took my daughter to Disneyland that day. And I'm a bit of an introvert, even though people are surprised when I say that, because I think I can actually project myself on video quite well now. But I'm actually kind of a homebody. I'm a bit of an introvert, and I kind of I can get overstimulated. After a 12-hour day at Disneyland, I was tired and overstimulated. And then we got home, put my daughter to bed, and then they showed up at like 9 p.m., maybe 9:30. And I'm tired, and they are so fired up, and they had gotten prophesied over at Bethel, and they just wanted to tell us about all the exciting things that had happened. And I was tired, and I was overstimulated, and I kind of dropped that. Problem is, anyway, we got into a big fight. Is the reality, and this big fight happened because I didn't accept a lot of what they were saying is the problem. And I just started arguing. And I started, I sort of, maybe when I'm tired like that, I might lose a little bit of my social niceties. And I went a little hard. And I remember I had a counselor at the time, and I was in therapy. I actually was struggling with some pretty severe depression before all this as well, just the relationship and the Christianity. And I was literally spinning before I even made the decision to not believe it anymore. And the contention was starting to grow. And I remember the counselor told me, don't talk about that with her family. Like, don't do it. You're going to create problems. You should really just try to keep, because they don't think like you. They're not as logical of a thinker as you. They're more like these value-based thinkers, and they want it to be true. So they're gonna, anyway. And I remember I'd be pulled aside, like at family gatherings. I remember one time he told me, you really gotta tone it down at the family gatherings. We're trying to have a good time here. We're trying to be, we're not talking about serious things at these family gatherings. They love to have these family gatherings. And I'm always like, well, I don't know how to talk about anything else. I'm not just a great small talker. So anyway, it all descended into this moment. I remember afterwards, I was telling my counselor, I was like, that thing you told me not to do? Well, I did it. And so
That's
I
awesome.
just let it all out. I shouldn't have done it. It created this big fight. They wouldn't talk to me for quite a while. But the problem is that really caused some more problems in the relationships. We had all these problems I was basically leaving Christianity, and now her family. And then I'm also a photographer, and I kind of enjoy taking pictures of people. And at the time, I was taking some pretty weird pictures. I was taking a lot more pictures of people without many clothes on. And I was just drawn to like the human form. And they really didn't like that, because it's almost like trying to, like, I almost wonder, I was so repressed sexually. It's like I was trying to normalize the human body for myself. It created all these problems. I eventually, it completely blew up. And I was I was close to suicidal, to be honest. At times, I left one day and I went and stayed in my parents' Airstream. And that was basically the end of the marriage. And everything blew up after that. And I won't go into the details of that, but it was a really hard time. But through that, I think I was able to then finally just admit publicly, because everybody was upset at me anyway, because as you know, in Christianity, relationships are almost viewed like, if two people just have drastically different personalities, different values, it's almost seemed like, no, that's not real. You just need God to help you fix that relationship, right? It's sort of like God fixes relationships. It doesn't matter if someone's emotionally abusive or what. Well, God just needs to fix them. So actually, that was about 4 years ago. And then I got more public with it. And then I did that video, and that caused more problems. And I started just I would go on Instagram on my Insta stories and I started saying all this stuff. I probably went a little hard. I started challenging all my Christian friends, challenging their beliefs. I think I was coming across a little strong. I eventually started watching those videos with the Socratic method. And I sort of I felt like I had to learn, okay, don't tell people, maybe more ask them questions. So that's sort of something I'm trying to do now. It's like I ask people questions to try to get them to think for themselves. But also what I've realized is that I've had so many debates at this point with various Christians, various Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, Muslims. And I've just kind of realized at this point, it's unlikely, really,
Yeah.
that I'm changing people's minds. People have to really make their own mind up.
Yeah.
Anyway, I
Well
feel like that was a
said.
long-winded thing to answer your question about the emotional state. But after I left, I feel like everything crumbled for me because so much of my identity, so much of my community, just the feeling that there was somebody that had my back, somebody that was listening to my thoughts, everything I thought. All of a sudden, I'm like, there's nobody listening to my thoughts. It means I don't need to feel guilty. I mean, so there's all these positives, but there's all these negatives. It's like I'm alone. And I think that's really it. Like I am all by myself. There's nobody really watching out for me here. I think that's really the comfort that I had. There's this guy up there and he has my back. And it's comforting. It's like a parental figure, but even better than that because he's helping you in all these mysterious ways because he loves you.
Yeah. In the sense that he's got a plan and he's going to make it all okay in the end.
Yeah. And so suddenly that was gone. And it's suddenly like, oh, there is no eternal life. Oh, this is just a huge game. This is worse than I ever thought. You know, this is a nightmare. I had basically had full-blown existential crisis for a time. And I was in the therapist's office, like just suicidal ideation.
Ideation. Just was it about the idea that you were losing the afterlife concept? Was that the big issue, or?
I think there was just so many things that happened all at once. There was that. There was the existential crisis. Who am I? What is my purpose? What is my meaning? I obsess about these things as it is. But then the whole relationship breakdown, and there's all these rumors that started and all these accusations. And then there was some people like almost after me. And I was like attacked in the street at one point. Like I had to like defend myself. And like there was all these lies and misconceptions about what was going on. And everybody thought I was cheating. And but the problem was I didn't defend myself very well. I kind of just hid away. And I don't think that helped. That really bothered me. I think I was a hardcore people pleaser. And I think Christianity almost encourages that. It's like, it's almost encourages passive aggression. I've begun to wonder because you can't be overtly aggressive. That's not very Jesus-like. So what if somebody is doing something to you or saying something to you? It's almost like, it's like that passive aggression. And I've begun to realize there's so much passive aggression built into Christianity. So I was this people pleaser and people's opinions of me was so important. And now that all these people were mad at me for leaving the relationship, for leaving Christianity, for this rumor about the whole cheating thing, which wasn't true, by the way. I couldn't handle that. I couldn't handle that all these people were upset with me. That just my ex-wife, I could barely tell her. I could barely formulate the words. The thought of letting her down. So anyway, it was a very interesting experience because I think through that experience, I like gained myself back. Yes, I was in a bad place, a very bad place. I'm glad I made it through it. I gained my self-worth back. I gained my confidence back. And I've sort of decoupled my opinion of myself from the way other people view me. And
Interesting.
I've talked about it on my channel, this whole people-pleasing thing, this codependency. It's like, how do you get over that? How do you get over people-pleasing and codependency? Well, I don't know, other than almost this exposure therapy, which is extremely difficult. So I went through that, and I do feel like now it's amazing. When I first started that YouTube channel, I was, get a bad comment, it would bother me so much. Now I get all kinds of bad comments, and it doesn't bother me the same way, unless it's a very pointed thing. Sometimes people can get under my skin, but
Yeah, I can definitely do that when I get dozens, maybe hundreds of nasty comments a week, and I definitely, at the beginning of my YouTube channel, when I was like just brainstorming if I do this, what would it look like? And I remember thinking through that issue very early on of if you do this, make the decision right now. You have to have a thick skin. People will attack you. You don't have to answer back. You just have to be willing to let them say their thing and move on. But yeah, it's definitely not for the light, for those who are faint of heart, as they say. Well, I do want to ask a couple things, because I know I've kept you here for a while. Number one, if it's not too personal, how did this affect your kids in terms of, obviously the marriage was unfortunate that it did dissolve, but how did this evolve to affect your children in terms of what did they understand? Have you been able to share with them over the years since then, in terms of what you do and don't believe and why? How do you see your role as a father to them at this point? And how many kids do you have, by the way?
I have two.
Okay.
So I have my 12-year-old daughter, and then my son is 6. So my son was only around 2 when that all happened. I have them with me 50% of the time. And it was like immeasurable. I've always been quite involved in their lives. Like, I wasn't the type of person who was just gone all the time. I worked from home. I've been a big part of parenting them, I guess, my whole life. There was just immeasurable amounts of guilt for me. That was a whole nother problem. I mean, that existential crisis I went through and that severe depression, they were a big part of that. But I feel like they're okay. But it is an interesting dynamic for them now. There is all kinds of problems right now. Huge problems.
Just because of your different worldviews competing?
Yes. And I've struggled with it immensely on how do I do this? Because my ex has almost gone, like, I think over time I had almost bent her ideas and values a little bit. So she's like a rubber band, but then I started to go further and like she couldn't go. And then as soon as the relationship ended, boom, she sprung right back. So she's now in this church that has what I view as damaging views towards women. And, just a real, almost Calvinist attitude. It's just like telling everybody that they're dirty, horrible sinners. And I can see it in my daughter. She is a lot like me in a way, which is good because maybe I know how to help her, but I can see that self-worth issue that I had. It's like, you are a sinner, you are worthless. I mean, that's so beat into you. And it kind of has to be, right? Because if you're not worthless, if you are okay on your own, well, then you don't really need a savior, right? So it is, I know I've had a couple arguments with Christians recently, and they're like, no, you're taking you're being too hard on, it's almost like straw manning Christianity. You're taking this out of context. I'm like, how can I be? Why do you need a savior? Why do you need one if you're okay on your own? You need one is because you're not okay on your own. You are a dirty sinner. Okay, I don't like to use the word dirty sinner. Use a different word. Use a more flowery word to say that you're a dirty sinner, basically, right? And I think this is what it comes down to. It's like the language. And I think they get around a lot of these things by using just more flowery language. And you can say that you're a dirty sinner, or you could say, you just, I don't even want to try.
But to jump in, you're right there, because there is a verse, and it's corroborated by other verses, but there's a verse that talks about your righteousness is like a filthy rag. And that word filthy rag, I mean, it's just like, I've heard it described by preachers as literally a word that they would use for menstrual clause. Like, this is literally something you're just going to discard when its usefulness is over. Like, you're just a piece of trash. And you get
your
that
righteousness is a dirty rag, like the best you can do.
Best you can do. And it really, like you said, with the true Calvinism of, you're not, the picture isn't like you're going to the idea of you being dead. Like, you're not this person drowning in the water, reaching up saying, God, I'm reaching up, please send me a life raft. You are the corpse at the bottom that's already sunk. You're decaying. You are completely dead. And therefore, like, your righteousness is literally the righteousness of a dead person, which is obviously not so good. So, like, everything you do is from that perspective. And yeah, you weave that into kids early enough. And I mean, it gets in your psyche, like you are truly depraved.
Yes. And I honestly believe that this is a bit of a personality issue. And sort of what I like psychology and I like the idea of personality because I do think that messages need to be modified depending on the person. If you're like this sort of egotistical, proud person that struggles with empathy and things like that, well, maybe you need to be toned down a bit and fine, go hard on that person that you're a dirty sinner. And even then, it's not even going to be internalized as much. But if you're like an insecure, kind of slightly codependent child who is just a people pleaser and is almost scared to speak up, and you already have a little bit of anxiety, and then you come along and just beat that person with the fact that they're a dirty sinner, and literally nothing they can do is good. I mean, you can literally damage a person long term, irreparably. And I really do believe that in some ways, I've been interested in this idea of religious trauma because I know I have a number of things. That is one of the things that I've been trying to get over. And I think I have. Like, it's amazing how a lot of my depression issues have gone away. And I think there's this whole other thing I could talk about, which is the whole demons thing. That was really also beat into me as a kid as well. And I became a very scared child. I was taught by my mom that I needed to pray demons out of rooms, right? That I'm scared in my room. That's not a coincidence. It means there's a demon in here. And I need to claim this room and cover this room in the blood of Jesus. I need to call my angels in because there's always angels here to help me, and there's demons, and it's my job to kind of like wrangle these angels in here to like get rid of the demons. And if I do it right, I'm gonna be okay. But if I'm not, like growing up at all these stories that I believe, my mom, it's like I don't want to talk to anything bad about my mom because I really do believe that she was doing the best that she could, and I believe that she was very stuck in this as well. So she's sort of a victim to it as much as I am. But stories of even seeing demons, which was terrifying to me. Stories of weird things happening, especially in my grandma's house. My grandma actually lived in Maui. And so my mom was fairly convinced that my grandma's house maybe was a little bit haunted and there's demons in there. And so when we would go over there and visit her, I mean, I was so scared all the time in this Maui house. And like weird stories. I could tell you the stories. One of them was like literally my mom woke up and saw this demon girl at the foot of the bed. And like, I'm a little annoyed that she would tell me that, first of all. I think if I had that happen, I wouldn't tell my kids. But the thing is, my mom's just a very open person. She just kind of tells everything. But it's funny. I think, what is a sleep disorder now. And I actually will wake up and it's almost like an awake dreaming thing. I see things in the room. It hasn't happened to me much the last couple of years, but back when it seems like stress and anxiety really causes this sleep disorder issue where I can see things and I can't tell if I'm dreaming or if it's real. So I've seen things in my room. I've seen, like, I wake up and I see people looking through the windows. If I tell this to a Christian, they'll immediately say, well, it's, are you sure that you're not possessed, or like there's not some kind of spiritual thing causing this, or maybe you really are seeing things. Maybe you're seeing into the spiritual realm. And it's like, no, it's actually just, there's perfectly rational explanations. It's a sleep disorder. And like your brain, it's like it's like producing chemicals to dream. And it seems like sometimes I can wake up and it's still happening and it's like dissipating, right? Turn on the light, it's over. But I think this is probably what happened to my mom too, but it's all the interpretation. It's interpreted in a spiritual way. So I grew up very scared of that. I could barely sleep in the dark. Even into my 30s. It really wasn't that long ago that if I was at home alone in the house, sleeping by myself, I'm scared. And I'm like, this is so irrational. Even after I didn't believe anymore, even if I was no longer a Christian, I'm still scared of something. I couldn't watch horror movies my whole life. So actually, about a couple of years ago, I started watching horror movies on purpose. And
Just to normalize the experience.
yeah, and like, I don't know, did you ever watch Midnight Mass?
Yes, that was a little freaky.
I I literally, that demon vampire thing that flew at the camera that one time, I literally jumped out of my seat and like ran across the room. Like, it was terrifying. I I barely could, like, if I went for 3 months, I could barely go to the bathroom at night because of that. And then I
Mm.
realized something. If I see a demon, if I see a vampire, I should count myself lucky, because then I would know it's real. But you know what? It's not. So I'm not going to see it. And it really, the last couple of years, I have gotten rid of that fear of the dark, fear of horror movies, and I can brush it off quicker. So I just think that there's just so much to unravel. And for me, like you said, I think that it was quick. You just quickly got over it. It wasn't like that for me. Like, I didn't believe anymore, but I do believe that there is this underlying, these things I have to undo in myself. So,
Mm. I was gonna say this is more of a tongue-in-cheek thing, but with the sleep, I had severe insomnia for the first 25 years of my life for the most part. And I actually moved from Philadelphia to Georgia for a very special doctor who cured it very quickly with no medicine, which was a wonderful thing and changed my life radically. But in the years before I moved to Georgia for this doctor, I had been to regular sleep doctors, and they would prescribe these medicines. And I remember this one I took. I found out later it was like a level 4 narcotic, but they prescribe it, for sleep on a regular basis. But I remember taking it, and I saw pirates around the bed, like real pirates. And I just, as soon
oh,
as I took it, I had hour-long phone calls that I was like, I couldn't remember the next day anything I'd said. So I got off of that pretty quickly. I took it, I think, for about 2 days, and was like, nah, this isn't worth it. This is too weird. But
oh,
I know that feeling through sleep medicines. So I can imagine that if you actually felt like you were seeing it without the aid of sleep medicines, that would really freak you out. Yeah. And I never got close to that worldview part of it per se. But I remember there was a series of books that a lot of people have also said they read by Frank Peretti, This Present Darkness, Piercing the Darkness, where he's describing what you're just saying, but like in these stories to the point where like you'd imagine yourself if you're in church and you're having trouble focusing on the preacher. You're like, I'm so bored. I like, or I'm, just imagining stuff. I'm like focused on the crown molding, like focus on the preacher. He's preaching the word of God to you. What is wrong with you? Don't worry about the crown molding in the window. But it's like you realize through these books, like, oh, the demons are trying to distract me and the angels are fighting or they're going to fight soon. And that if I could see like what's above me in this huge church, there's actually like angels and demons with like invisible swords and
yeah,
knives, like pirates, fighting. And like that, but that was the picture you got. And I remember when I fortunately didn't have that too much woven into my worldview as a kid, but when I read those books, I began to think how accurate is this to what's actually happening all around me. And it really was terrifying. It really scared me. And I remember
yeah,
bringing it up to a lady at church, a dear friend. Um, and I was telling her like, look, I'm reading these books, and I think this is helping because it's helping me to see there's a spiritual realm to reality that I'm not in tune with. And her response, which was helpful at the time, was just, yeah, but always keep in mind, God is so much stronger than the demons and the devil. Like there's no comparison. His strength is so much higher. And I was like, yeah, you're right. In the big picture, he's gonna win. God's gonna win. So it kind of things like that, conversations like that, thoughts like that assuaged it a little bit, but it still gave me a little bit of the, proverbial terrors, not actual night terrors, but proverbial terrors of what was going on in the unseen realm. And I definitely I did feel that like one thing that it primed me for was to say, you really are not seeing reality the way God sees it. Like, regardless of angels and demons, you need to see ultimate reality. And I remember C.S. Lewis, he was instrumental in this as I read through some of his books, but he would talk about, like, if you were to see a person that you just think they're physically attractive, and you might take that as your quick assessment. You just meet them, bam, you've got a millisecond. Oh, that's an attractive person. But he painted this picture of, like, you don't understand. They're going to become something in the afterlife. Let's say that they're not saved, they're not a Christian. So the only thing that they have going for them is their sinful self. This eventually going to become almost like its own demon that takes over their temporary physical body. And if you could see them in their true form, they would be so hideous. You wouldn't think, oh, that's a attractive person. You'd think that's like a demon. Like, oh my gosh, what is going on there? That's a horrific monster. And conversely, if that person is eventually going to become a Christian, or is a Christian, is going to eventually go to heaven, and God's going to glorify them, that you would think, oh my gosh, that person isn't just like attractive temporarily in their physical body. This is like an angel. Oh my gosh, they're so glorious. You'd be tempted to bow down and worship them. And these pictures got painted of, like, even though you can't see that stuff, you can't see the angels and demons, you can't see what that person is going to be really become as a monster in hell or an angel-like person in heaven. You need to have the eyes to begin to transform your worldview now and see ultimate reality as it is. And one of the things that it did for me in a very negative sense was I began to see people, not actually see it, but like in my mind, I made this happen where I'd see people burning on fire. And it was a reminder to me that person that's not saved is not just a person. They're a person that's going to be in hell someday. And so I would walk around and, if you, for example, saw a really pretty girl and you think, oh, your millisecond response is, she's so gorgeous. In my mind, to keep myself off of thinking of her in a pornographic sense, but also to try to get back to reality, quote unquote, I would, in my mind, picture her on fire, like as if she was, doused in gasoline and flamed up. But like to think that's the real girl. The real girl isn't this pretty girl with curves that you're thinking, wow, she's sexy. The real girl is in flames, screaming. So don't worry about how attractive it might be. Worry about her soul. Get that soul saved. She's going to burn. And it creates that, like you said, the OCD and the anxiety of, like, you have the weight of the world, that if you don't do something, like, you're now that that's more real than the facade of just she's a pretty girl. The real reality is she's in grave danger. You're now responsible, hyper responsible, to do whatever you can to be faithful, to pull her out, to give her the message that her house is on fire, escape. And when you think of people that way, and you're constantly condemning everyone, obviously anybody who's not a Christian is in that condemned state, and you are in the hyper responsible phase of saying, you must, nothing else matters in life, save these people, they're on fire. You do that to a kid, and mix, maybe putting that story in the mixture of what you said about the the Calvinism and you're a filthy rag, that you've really, when you step back from this stuff, you realize this is psychological child abuse. This is not like equivocal, like, oh, well, you believe what I believe, or you believe what you believe, I believe what I believe. We'll just agree to disagree. Like, technically, yeah, and in one sense, we have to do that to survive and be amicable to each other. But when you step back, I can't just say I'm okay with you just doing what you believe in that stuff, because you're truly, if you pass it on, you are psychologically abusing children. And that's so painful to realize that it's happening every day all over the planet.
Yes, I have said the same thing. I've said, is indoctrination child abuse? Well, what is indoctrination? And I think really what it is, I've thought about this quite a bit, is like, for example, if you teach your child when the stove is on not to touch it because they'll burn their hand, that is something that's protecting them. And that is a truth, right? Like it's a fact. I don't even like to use the word true and truth anymore, because it's just like, so, I mean, I don't know anything about what is true. And there's no way to even prove things are true, but I won't go down that. I'll look at it more like a fact. If you touch the stove, you'll burn your hand. So you teach your child, don't do that. Don't touch this. No matter what you do not touch this hot thing. But now, if you turn around and teach an opinion in the same way as a fact, if you do this, you will die. If you do this, you will burn in hell forever. That is what's damaging, because kids can't tell the difference between this real fact and this fake fact. And I think it could all be better if people taught it as well, I believe that this will happen, even though I don't know it's going to happen. And I think that Christians are extremely confused about the definition of belief. They think it means no. They're like, if they believe it, it is true 100%. So of course I'm not going to treat it like there's any possibility that it could be wrong. Well, then I'm like, well, why wouldn't you just use the word no then? There's definitely a confusion between that word. And so then they're teaching their kids their beliefs as if they're facts. And yeah, it's actually the biggest problem I have with my kids, because it's a very delicate thing. They will come over and tell me something that they have learned as a fact. And I want to say, that is stupid. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You should not believe that. But of course I can't say that, because it would make them feel bad. It also creates contention with their mother. And so I don't want to triangulate. I don't want to pit myself and her, and now they have to pick a side. That is the last thing I want for them. So it's sort of like the only thing I can do, and sort of the only way I've gone, is to teach them that different people have different opinions of the world. Different people have different beliefs. So yes, these people over there do believe that. I happen to believe something different. Who's right? You don't really know. It's the only thing I've thought of so far on how to deal with that. But, when I was growing up, I didn't have that other voice that said a little bit of logic and reason here and there. Oh, by the way, not everybody believes that thing right there. There's other people who believe these things. And so sometimes I'll pepper in things that other religions believe. Oh, actually, like, no, the Muslims, they actually believe blah, blah, blah. Or over, if you were born in India, you'd probably be Hindu or something, and you'd probably believe this and this. And really, your beliefs are, more than anything, dependent on where you were born. So that's the only way I really know how to deal with that indoctrination issue.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. One thing I love to do, and I've got one final question for you, and we'll wrap up. I love to do this game with my kids where I pretend they've got a bubble around their head. Like if you imagine like a spacesuit where it's like all glass, and I'll say, you have a worldview bubble around your head that you have to protect. And I'll say, I'm going to pretend like as if it were like one of those soap bubbles, where you blow through the hole and it blows a big bubble up. Like, I'm going to pop your bubble, or I'm going to get in the bubble of your head. And I said, when I come over and pretend I'm going to get into your bubble around your head, you are free to push me away. So I'll say, you have to believe just like I do. And they'll say, no, I don't. So you have to be an atheist. No, I don't. You have to be a Christian. No, I don't. You have to believe like the church. No, I don't. And we go through it. And the other thing I say with them a lot is, I'll simply ask the question, guys, who has the power over your minds? Who has the power over what you believe? And they know that they're free to say, I do. I have the power over my mind. And I think when I combine things like that, it's not necessarily that I'm failing to tell them what I believe, because I do weave that in. I talk about mythology a lot, but I'm still saying this is ultimately, at the end of the day, an autonomy issue. You get to live the best life that you want, but you also get to have that choice within the context of not everybody's around you saying, you have to be like me, and if you don't believe like me, really bad things are going to happen. Like, to take the threats away and just say, you get to make your own life. You get to make it the best life possible the way you want to. And if you choose to do it differently than me or someone else, that's perfectly acceptable. As I say, you do you. You pick the path that feels right to you. And also to say, but whatever path you pick, do it with all the information. If somebody says you have to believe this, well, ask them, where did that belief come from? How did it evolve? Who's been in control of it? And to give people that power and the autonomy and the education, I think it's a great starting point to just give people that sense of this is, we're going to transform not just the narrative about comparative mythology and expose the mythology behind Christianity, but we're going to change the narrative of whether or not you have to believe. And it doesn't mean they have to be atheists or agnostics. You can believe what you want to believe, but we're going to take away the threat language. It's like there's no more, you got to believe like me or else. Like that's got to stop. And I think to me, one of the best things that's happened is my kids truly, I think they don't fear hell. I truly don't think they fear it, not because they're not afraid of this concept of, as we all would be if it were real, but just the idea of like, I understand where it came from. I understand Gehenna. I understand Tartarus. I understand the lake, I understand what happened in the Iliad and the Odyssey. I understand how the Greek mythology evolved, and the clear fact that the New Testament copies even the very words for these Greek places. They understand it's just part of a mythological system. And it's taken this dark concept, it's brought it into the light, and it's losing its power. Like this has no power over them, which is, to me, is such a good thing for my heart. The threats are being minimized. I know I've chatted for a while. I did want to kind of ask a question I ask a lot when I'm wrapping up an interview. This, obviously, we could, number one, talk about endless kind of subtopics that you've kind of brought up here, and we had to move on past them. But there's just so many avenues to how to unpack Christianity, how to respond to it. But I think one of the hardest parts about this is the whole dynamic, that if you choose to leave, if you choose to even heavily deconstruct, and can kind of predict that you're going to be ostracized, you're going to be punished, shunned, whatever happens. There's people that are going to say, even if they're still willing to very much talk with you and communicate with you, that they're thinking in your head, things like, you're obviously deceived, you want to sin, you're a bad person. Why do you want to throw away your life? You may be dangerous to have around other people because you're going to be disruptive to the clear direction of our home or our family, which is we're a family that honors God. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So that you get the real strong sense that if you pursue this deconstruction, and certainly if you're vocal about it in any way, especially if you develop a platform as you and I have done, that people are going to hate you, they're going to be upset at you, and that it's going to be painful. So for the person that's in that spot where they're saying, nobody knows yet, but in my heart of hearts, I don't think this is probably real. And I know if I speak up much, even just asking good questions, they're going to question me and know what's going on. And some really bad responses could occur. For someone that's just at the beginning of this, where they're saying, I've got more of this to study, I've got more research to do, but right now, this is leaning heavily towards, I don't think this actually is real. What would you say to someone who's just at the cusp of that journey and with all those questions in mind?
Yeah, I think first of all, I would say I don't think that they hate me. I just think that Christians have been trained to trust other Christians. And so if you're all of a sudden not in the club, I think it's not that they hate you, it's just that the trust might go away.
Yeah.
And so now people that used to be open with me and friends, they're distant. I don't hear from them as much. It's turned into more of an acquaintance. Certain people, I think the really interesting thing about it is it's almost a blessing in disguise, because you really do learn who your friends are. And so a few of my Christian friends have stuck with me. And to be honest, I would say we're almost closer as a result. It's a really interesting place to be in too, because now people seem to find me when they're going through that place, because they don't have anybody else to talk to. I've been kind of vocal in public about it, and they're like, oh, maybe I should go talk to him. So I have walked a number of people through that process, actually.
That's awesome.
But I think if I had to give one piece of advice, it's just to not argue. I think I've learned that the hard way a few times. You will never argue somebody out of their beliefs. It's just, I've done it lots of times. I've argued with so many people at this point, hundreds of people, let's just say, over text, because of these videos. And they're literally, I have heard from Actually, it has happened. I think I've heard from 2 or 3 people that said your video, actually, and the thing is, it wasn't a result of the argument, but I did have 2 or 3 people that have said, because of your video, I deconstructed from Christianity. And your
Mm.
video gave me the courage to do that. And I would say, well, was it really my video, or was it already you? And you were just looking for that reason. Um, so I think it's like I think it's that realization that if somebody is really strong in their beliefs, actually, I had a friend say it to me recently. He sort of came to this point and he's like, you, just so you know, are very unlikely to change my beliefs. And that's the truth of it. So really, now that you know that, my goal, and I don't always do this perfectly, I admit but it is my goal, is that if I do have a conversation with somebody about it, whether that's a family member or somebody else, the goal is end this conversation so that there will be means to have future conversations. You do not want to end that conversation in a fight or in an antagonistic way, or you're accusing them of things, or you're accusing them of contradictions. It was something that I really struggle with. I'm like, you hypocrite. You said this last week and now you're doing this. You shouldn't call people hypocrites. You can be really gentle when you point out the contradictions in their thinking, because I think a lot of Christians are stuck in cognitive dissonance. Which is what? Holding 2 contradictory ideas as true at the same time. And it creates stress. I used to be in it. I'm trying to get rid of that. So it's not easily undone. So yeah, that's my goal. I try to ask questions of people now instead of tell them. That's really it.
Mm.
And then have
Well
that
said.
goal of, can I have another? I want this conversation to end so that there's room for another one.
Yeah, well said. I think that's a great way to put it. And yeah, I think too, there's the idea, I forget the proverb, there's a proverb that's coming to mind, but something about when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. But in a similar vein, like sometimes it's just not time yet. As the Matrix talked about, some people just aren't ready to be unplugged. If you push, and there's people I've talked to who, reached out to me or I've interviewed where they'll say, you know what, my spouse deconverted, and I was so angry at them, and 5 years later, there I was doing the same thing. And I'm obviously, from my vantage point, very jealous of that, because eventually that means that their marriage, they were on the same page again, and their marriage is thriving, which is, very much a wish that I have, and I don't get to live that out myself right now. But still, it's like they're admitting, like, if somebody pushed me back then, like, you need to examine, this is mythology, it doesn't make sense, it's, the Yahweh character is psychopathic and narcissistic. I can't hear that today. Today he's a good father and it's all inerrant. But there's going to be a day, maybe, and we can't predict anything, of course, for our loved ones, but there may be a day for some of our loved ones where they step back. And I think for some people too, it's like there is a message to be given, but we're not the messenger. Like, for example, I know that there's some people in my life that I think I could say the same thing over and over and over in different ways, and it will never get through. But I know that there's certain other friends that they have that are, the good, godly, Jesus is Lord kind of friends, where it's all Christian. That if some of those friends ever deconverted and then shared the story with my loved ones, that they would make a bigger impact. And I'd love to be the one to have made that impact, but I know I'm not going to do it based on the history and what's been happening. But I know that other friends, other dear friends of theirs, would actually make a huge difference to their thinking through it, and that they would, for whatever reason, they've chosen not to listen to me, but they would listen to that person and that person. And you never know which person is going to be the next person to deconvert, deconstruct. And there's obviously more and more of us these days, so hopefully the odds are going up. But it's, I think too, that admitting, to me, I'll just add to this, to wrap this discussion up, is I think there has to be an admission at some point to ourselves, in our, perhaps our loneliness, of realizing that this journey is at least temporarily ours alone to take, that our loved ones aren't necessarily going to go through on this journey with us. That you do at some points have to be okay, and train yourself to be okay with the idea that this might not work out with a happy ending. And that breaks your heart. It breaks your heart so much. We all want the ideal. We all want families to stay intact. We all want things to work out well in the end. But some of those stories, our love stories, aren't always going to work out the way we would hope. And to start to say, like, you can still take these broken pieces and these ashes and you can make something beautiful. And it's not because Yahweh's going to do it, because Yahweh's going to restore the years the locusts have eaten, but you can do it because you can actually, knowing that there is no actual real purpose in life, you can make your purpose, make life beautiful. But from where I'm standing and from where most of my interviewees, what they say is life eventually, after you kind of settle the fog of everything of deconversion, life is actually much more peaceful and beautiful in the long run, because you realize so much of the lies are gone and you begin to be freed up to be more artistic and creative and loving and caring, and loving not because you want to get to heaven and get crowns to give to Jesus, but just loving because you just want to. And life eventually gets more beautiful. And to think, despite the pain that may or may not be temporary or permanent, despite the losses, there are still some beautiful, beautiful things that can be had. And I love to just emphasize again, as maybe a final note, kids, the next generation, they will pick up on some of these things. They may not hear everything we say, but they'll pick up on our drive for the truth. I know it's, the word can be vague in how we apply it, but our desire to at least believe fewer false things than we used to believe, or to let fewer false things into our heads, and to pursue things that are much more rational, and to get rid of the irrationality. But we're planting seeds, and we might not always see the fruit of it, but to think someday these little seeds of this and that and the other, they're going to grow, and people are going to ask us, they're going to say, why is Clay not a believer in Jesus, but he's got so much love in his heart? How can that be possible? How can he have such a beautiful song in his heart that he literally comes out within in his own music? How can he be so loving and gracious and generous and patient? He's got the fruit of the spirit, and he doesn't even believe there's a spirit. And it's like, oh, okay. And they put the pieces together, and I think those seeds are beautiful. So, and I just want to commend you for your YouTube channel. I think it's great. It's influenced me positively. And I know it's influenced other people, like you said, but thank you for being willing to plant those seeds. And I hope it's just hopefully a better and better turn of events and story for your own loved ones and for your family.
All right. Well, I appreciate you having me on here. It was a good conversation. Enjoyed
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. Was there any final words you had? I don't know if I asked all the right questions today, but was there anything I didn't ask that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I mean, the reality is I could probably have a 12-hour conversation about this stuff. Like, it just never ends. And
Yeah.
but me and my current partner, we just talk about it all the time. So yeah,
As it
it's
should
just
be.
really a huge topic. And but I feel like we touched on a lot of it, so it was
Yeah.
good.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I'll just wrap up then by saying we've been speaking with Clay Arnall. Clay, thank you so much. And again, everyone, please go like and subscribe. But Clay, great to get to know you. Great to hear your story. We really appreciate your voice in the community.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Clay.
Okay, bye.